Hello, everyone. Welcome to the fourth and final lecture in our Climate Futures Climate Justice series. My name is Leah Aronowski. I'm a fellow here in the Society of Fellows, and along with Jörg Schaffer, who is a faculty member in the Department of Earth, Environmental Sciences at Columbia. I'm one of the organizers here of this lecture series, which has featured a range of scholars who are thinking seriously about what it will actually take to achieve a justice-centered climate future. I have a few people and institutions to thank before we get started. So our lecture series is generously made possible by the Society of Fellows and the Heyman Center for the Humanities. And here I'll put a special thank you to Sylvia Gindick and Lindsay Schramm, who have supported us both administratively and in terms of tech. We are also supported by the Columbia Climate School and the Lamont Doherty Earth Institute Climate Center, the Center for Science and Society, and last but not least, the Decarbonization, Resilience, and Climate Justice Network at the Climate School. I'm going to introduce our moderator, Ege Yumisak, who will then introduce our speaker, Mijin Cha. But I'll just say that it's an absolute thrill to have you here, Mijin. Your work has really been super influential into how I think about my own research and especially how I teach. So it's just a real pleasure to have you here. But our friend over here, Ege Yumisak, is a philosopher and labor organizer. She is a current fellow in the Society of Fellows here, and she received a PhD in philosophy from Harvard in 2022. Her research focuses on political disagreement and the role of the attention economy in expanding and restricting horizons of political possibility. She is also a charter member of United Auto Workers 5118 and a member of the reform caucus within the UAW called Unite All Workers for Democracy, which seeks to build worker power for electric vehicle transition. Her writing on organizing asks questions about the role of labor organizing in reshaping higher ed. Okay.
Thank you, Leah. I'll introduce our amazing speaker. Thank you all for being here and tuning in. Mijin Cha is an assistant professor in the Environmental Studies Department at University of California, Santa Cruz. She's also a fellow at Cornell University's Worker Institute and a board member of Center on Race, Poverty, and the Environment, Greenpeace USA Fund, and Welcome Ideas. She has held positions as a scholar and analyst at more institutions than I can name. And we're delighted to have her here to talk to us about her research into just transition, how to transition to a low carbon economy in a way that protects workers and communities. So please welcome with me, Professor Mijin Cha.
Well, thank you, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you especially to Leah and the Heyman Center and the Society of Fellows. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for everyone who's joining online. I just want to say hi to my parents who are also online. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some work that I've done on this area of climate policy called Just Transition, the importance of power organizing and framing in decarbonization. So is this maybe... Oh, great. So I have to apologize at the beginning because I have extremely rudimentary PowerPoint skills, as you can see by my clip art. But so just an overview, I'll start by talking about where we are in terms of our emissions and our oil and gas production, and then where we need to go to meet targets of net zero by 2050, which we know we need to do to preserve our habitable planet. And then how we get there. And this is where I want to talk about this idea of just transition, which has become increasingly mainstreamed, which is good, but also as it has been mainstreamed, has become co-opted. So I'm going to present some research that we've done on stakeholder views of just transition and the importance of power organizing and framing. So where we are, and I know most of you who are here obviously know this, but just so that we kind of have some grounding here, the latest IPCC report issues some dire warnings that we need to have global emissions must drastically reduce. And I'll also point out that the IPCC report is clear that the issue of climate change is now political and not technical, which means that we have the technical advances that we need to have rapid decarbonization, but what is really preventing us are our political issues. So nearly 90% of all carbon emissions come from fossil fuel extraction and use. So it is really the use of fossil fuels that is causing the climate crisis. And then emissions continue to rise with record levels of oil and gas production. So this chart, it shows that our emissions are increasing. And what I want to point out here especially is that, you see this dip during the COVID-19 pandemic of 5.2%. And I think this is really important because you hear a lot about individual behavioral change and the link to climate crisis. And during this time period, which is when we had the most individual behavioral change that we probably could ever see, people didn't really go anywhere. We only saw an emissions reductions of 5.2%, which means we need structural decarbonization. Right? We cannot individual carbon footprint our way out of the climate crisis. Similarly, we see that oil and gas production has largely rebounded from during the COVID time. What I really want to point out here is that it is continuing to increase, even though we hear a lot about how we have increasing levels of renewable energy production, which is true. We have record levels of renewable energy production, but it has yet to displace any fossil fuel extraction and use. So while we have record levels of renewable energy production, we also have record levels of oil and gas production, which means that we cannot guarantee that there will be an energy transition just by generating renewable energy. We must have decarbonization. We have to have a drawdown of fossil fuel production and use. So where do we need to go? We cannot meet our carbon neutral target by 2050 without ending the use of fossil fuels. I cannot stress this enough. We have to end fossil fuel extraction and use. There is no way to address the climate crisis without ending fossil fuel production and use. And I think this is really important during this time period because I think a lot of people think we can have both and, right? So we can have, robust oil and gas production and also meet our carbon targets. I want to be very clear that that is not possible. We must end fossil fuel production and use, which means that we need a rapid energy transition away from fossil fuels to renewable energy. And this is, again, something that I'll point out continually because we need an energy transition, which means we have to transition away from fossil fuels. You hear a lot about an energy transition, but we have yet to transition, right? The previous graph showed we still have record levels of oil and gas production, which means we are not transitioning away from fossil fuels. And the point here also that we need more than a fuel source replacement. Again, something that I'll continue to return to, which is that we can't just say that we have existing systems and structures and just swap out fossil fuels for renewable energy, right? The example that I like to use is that if every private car became an electric vehicle, that actually won't get us that far towards addressing the climate crisis. We need to really reconfigure towards public transportation, smaller vehicle use. We can't just assume that we have the exact same consumption and behavioral patterns that we have now and just swap out renewable energy for fossil fuels. We need transformative change. So here is a graph of what our current trend is. If we continue on our current trend, we'll have 3.5 degrees Celsius warming, which we know is catastrophic. And what we need to do is by 2050 to be on a 1.5 degrees Celsius path, we really have to get to net zero. And I want to take a moment to kind of acknowledge that seeing data like this can cause a lot of climate anxiety and a climate despair. And that is very valid and legitimate, right? It is daunting to think about where we need to go, but that shouldn't paralyze us. It's not going to be easy, but it's certainly something that we can do. Remember, the IPCC says that we have the technology that we need, right? The problem that we have is political. And again, not easy, but politics can change. So while these things, this kind of data can be overwhelming, I just want us to see it so that we understand where we need to go, so that we understand the challenges that we have. But by no means is it impossible. So this chart is a little bit overwhelming again, but what I want to point out is just some key indicators of where we need to go, and so we understand again the scale of our challenge. So by 2030, which is in less than 10 years, it's about 7 years, we need to phase out all unabated coal plants in developed economies. Unabated means that there is no carbon capture. So all coal-fired power plants that don't have any kind of carbon capture need to be closed within about 7 years. No new internal combustion engines by 2035, so just a little over 10 years. And then all unabated coal in developed and developing economies phased out by 2040. So pretty big shifts that need to happen in relatively short amount of time. And I think it's also really important to see this kind of graph to know that, again, there's no way that we can meet any of these targets without ending fossil fuel production and use, right? So you don't get to phasing out internal combustion engines without phasing out internal combustion engines, right? Without ending the use of oil. So I want to take a minute to talk about where we don't need to go. And as I mentioned earlier, there is this greenwashing that is happening. So for instance, Shell, which is one of the top 5 oil companies in the world, has this statement on their website that says, quote, Shell supports the Paris Agreement on climate change, which recognizes the importance of a just transition. A just transition means a fairer distribution of the costs and benefits of the world's transition to a net zero emissions energy system. Just transition is referenced in the Paris Agreement as acknowledgement that governments need to take into account the imperatives of a transitioning workforce during the shift to a low carbon economy. So a couple of points here, which is one, that Shell supports the Paris Agreement, which we know supports limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, which means, again, we have to common chorus, we have to phase out fossil fuels. But two, interestingly, right, governments need to take into account the imperatives of a transitioning workforce. So not the private sector, but that governments need to take into account the transitioning workforce. This is, of course, followed by this disclaimer, which is under the legal disclaimer that you have to click through on their website, which says, quote, the use of the term Shell's net carbon footprint is for convenience only and not intended to suggest these emissions are those of Shell or its subsidiaries. So we don't really release any emissions. Cool. It is important to note that as of February 11th, 2021, Shell's operating plans and budgets do not reflect Shell's net zero emissions target. Shell's aim is that in the future, its operating plans and budget will change to reflect this movement towards this new net zero emissions target. However, these plans and budgets need to be in step with the movement towards a net zero emissions economy within society and among Shell's customers. So does Shell really want a just transition? Well, they don't really want a transition, let alone one that is just. But if you go onto their website, the first thing you see, right, is their commitment to just transition. And then you have to click through, which people like me do, to their legal disclaimer, which then says, actually, we have no intention of changing our operating plans and budget. So no change in their operating plans and budget, which means that they have no intention to stop mining oil and gas, right? The other point about this, that where we don't need to go. So this is from British Petroleum's Energy Outlook, which is the amount of emissions that they claim will be captured by carbon capture. It's about 15% of their emissions total. So a couple of points about this is that carbon capture has still yet to be proven at scale, which means that even these pilot projects, they haven't really been able to capture any meaningful amount of emissions. Two, they are largely on power plants, which is a sector that we know, electricity is a sector that we know that we can decarbonize. So we really shouldn't be capturing carbon. The captured carbon has largely been used for enhanced oil recovery, which means that those carbon streams are then piped back into oil wells to get the last amount of oil out. And the last point here is that, to capture carbon, you have to generate carbon. So my concern about these things is that it is just a way for us to continue fossil fuel extraction and use, because again, to capture carbon, you have to produce carbon. And the idea then that you would retrofit a power plant with something like a carbon capture system, it's quite a large capital cost. So that they would then be shut down in 2 or 3 years, unlikely, right? That cost has to be recovered, which means that we have to continue to generate those carbon so that it can be captured. And you see this endless cycle that will continue our fossil fuel extraction and use. So this is not to say that there are not sectors that are hard to decarbonize that could perhaps be used. We could have some carbon capture. But what we see is that the discourse is largely being around carbon capture as a real source and main tool for decarbonization, when really what we need to decarbonize is to decarbonize, right? We need to not produce carbon emissions. Okay, so then how do we get there? So we know we have to have an energy transition, we know we have to decarbonize, and we know that there are all these other factors that we have to take into consideration, like social and economic considerations. So this is what we consider this idea of just transition. So what is just transition? So the origins of just transition are with the late labor leader, Tony Mazzocchi, who, along with environmental justice leaders, called for a superfund for workers and communities. So just some history is that Tony Mazzocchi was the head of the Oil and Atomic Chemical Workers Union. And he argued that there were some industries that are too toxic for society to continue. We could now argue that fossil fuels are too toxic for society to continue. But the idea is that as we move away from these toxic industries, it shouldn't be the workers and communities that have become economically dependent upon these industries that should suffer in this transition away. So this idea of the Superfund for workers is modeled on the Superfund program, which is a program run by the Environmental Protection Agency, where polluting industries have to pay forward into this fund so that when their industries shut down, that pollution that they have created is cleaned up. So the idea being that we have these resources and reserves to kind of remediate and take care of workers and communities that are dependent upon these industries that we now consider to be too toxic to continue. So in short, it is understanding and addressing the negative economic and social impacts to industrial transitions. And here, I think it's really important that we just acknowledge that there will be negative economic and social consequences to decarbonization. We don't want to hide from that fact. It's not all sunshine and roses. But if we know what will happen, then we can then mitigate them, right? So it's not like we don't know what to do, we just are not doing it yet. So understanding the negative economic and social impacts to industrial transitions helps us then create proactive just transition policies. And then finally, it is fundamental to addressing the jobs versus environment false narrative. So for a long time, corporations have said basically, if you make us do anything that costs money, like enhanced environmental regulations, the only option we have then is to lay off our workforce because we have these increased costs. We know that this is both a false choice, but also if we understand what that means, it means that basically we are sacrificing workers to be because they are at the front line of these polluting industries. So the idea that you could not afford environmental regulations means that you're just exposing those workers to that contamination. And we in fact know that this is a false choice, right? We can have both jobs and the environment. And in fact, it is just the private companies that have used this narrative to split workers and environmentalists so that we can split the political power that is against corporate interests. So there are some things that we have to consider when we think about a just transition, transition considerations. So the first is the quantity and quality of jobs. And what I mean by this is that, you kind of see these projections, I don't know if many of you have seen, like millions of renewable energy jobs created, which is true, but we need to really think about what is the quality of job that we are creating. So it's not just how many jobs are we creating, but what kind of jobs are we creating? Because we need to ensure that the job quality and renewable energy needs meet fossil fuel job quality. So fossil fuel jobs, we know, have higher rates of unionization and higher wages. And I think it's important here to note that the reason why they have higher rates of unionization and higher wages is not because the fossil fuel industry is a benevolent employer, right? It is through worker struggle that these jobs became good jobs. So that same worker struggle, right, can make renewable energy good jobs. They're not, inherently bad jobs. The second consideration is ensuring wage parity, benefits, and seniority transfer. And what that means is that, if you have a certain wage that you've gotten from working in the fossil fuel industry for 10 years, you shouldn't then transition into an introductory job, right, where you lose your benefits, you lose your seniority. And I think if we take a step back and think about these consequences, right, if you make a decent wage and you have some seniority and benefits, why would you transition to an unknown future for a job that is of a worse quality, right? The next consideration is reskilling and new skills training. So there are some jobs that we can just reskill that would be, so for instance, if you build oil and gas pipelines, a little reskilling, and then you can build geothermal pipelines. And some jobs will require new skills training. And here I think we should think more broadly about what we mean by low carbon jobs. So for instance, if you're a coal miner and you want to be a teacher, you should be a teacher. And there are other skills that should be trained, but the reason why I bring this up is that we don't want to start having these kind of tone deaf conversations like coal miners will become coders, which was actually a thing for a while. So really thinking about kind of what skills will be needed, what jobs are being created, and then ensuring that those skills and those jobs are aligned. And the last point is geographical alignment. So again, what we're trying to do is have these conversations of where jobs are being created and where jobs are being lost to kind of align a little bit better. So for instance, most of the renewable energy jobs are being created in states like California, where we know that fossil fuel jobs are being lost in other places like Appalachia. But actually some research that we've done has found that even in California, we have an oil and gas region in California, and even in California, the renewable energy jobs are not necessarily being created where fossil fuel jobs are being lost. That doesn't mean that, that's for a lot of reasons, including where resources are located. So it's not necessarily that we have to have a one-to-one replacement, but we want to be thinking about where jobs are being created and where jobs are being lost so that people who are losing their jobs actually have access to jobs, right? The second consideration is community supports and investment. So, a lot of these fossil fuel communities, their only tax revenue comes from fossil fuel activity. So when that goes away, that means that you lose funding for things like schools and for infrastructure. So understanding kind of where those community investments are, and then what investments can we make to help diversify their economy so that they become stronger, right? What we don't want to do is replace a monodependent, so one industry for one industry, because when that industry goes away, those communities are still left vulnerable. So how can we diversify these economies so that they are stronger, so they can kind of weather transitions? And the last point is ensuring equitable access to opportunities, addressing past harms, and meaningful participation for directly impacted stakeholders. So to unpack this a little bit, we want to ensure equitable access to opportunities, which means that a lot of our conversation in just transition is kind of dominated by coal miners. Coal miners are overwhelmingly male and white. And there are large populations that never had access to these fossil fuel jobs. So if we think about transition in a very narrow way of just transitioning those workers, you exclude a huge population of people that never had economic opportunity in the first place. That is not a just transition, right? So when we think about the transition opportunities for the future, we need to ensure that there is equitable access, particularly for people who have been excluded from the fossil fuel economy. The second point is addressing past harms. There's a lot of damage that has happened from fossil fuels that is in addition to the climate crisis. So as we transition away from fossil fuels, we have to think about that pollution, those legacy of pollution, the legacy of the health harm that has come from it as we transition away. And then the meaningful participation for directly impacted stakeholders. There are several reasons why this is important. One, it's the right thing to do. But two, if we want to have transition policies that are really meet people where they're at, that we really can support these communities, there's nobody that knows what they need more than these directly impacted stakeholders. So engaging directly impacted stakeholders ensures that we actually are creating better policies. And the second point is that, we need to build power, which I'll talk about a little bit more in depth later, but we need power to overcome the power of the fossil fuel industry. And when you engage people directly from the beginning, right, you're doing also that organizing and power building that you need to ensure that those policies eventually get passed. So then I think it raises this question of like, okay, why does transition have to be just? So if we think about it, we know we have to have an energy transition. There are these transition considerations, but why does it have to be just? So one is we have a history of unjust transition. So, the energy transition, it is not our first industrial transition, and it probably won't be our last. So transition in and of itself is not necessarily bad, right? As economies develop and as technology advances, there will be some transition. We have largely been unable to transition workers and communities away from a declining industry in a way that is just. So we think about globalization and deindustrialization, right? It just left swaths of communities across the Midwest and the Northeast with nothing. That then deepens distrust of an energy transition because people have yet to see a just transition. So when you start talking about something like an energy transition, they automatically assume that they will just be left behind. The second point is if we think about how integrated fossil fuels are in our economy and our society, we cannot have that level of disruption be unjust, right? The scale of the fossil fuel transition, for that to be unjust, it will be so disruptive to society that it's something that we have to avoid at all costs. Understanding contestation, the role of identity, and the opportunity for social acceptance. So, what I mean by this is that, the fossil fuel transition is more than just an energy source replacement. So if we can understand contestation, right, understand why people are opposed to fossil fuels, if we can understand the role of identity, and here I want to point out, that the fossil fuel industry has spent millions of dollars on ways to ensure that people see their identity integrated with fossil fuels. So I am a coal miner, and that means that I'm a coal person, right? This doesn't excuse the need, it's not meant to delay an energy transition. But if we understand that kind of the way that identity has been integrated with fossil fuels, it makes us more effective at organizing. And then the opportunity for social acceptance. So if we have these more just and equitable approaches, we actually increase social acceptance for an energy transition, which then actually helps accelerate an energy transition because it reduces opposition, right? So the more just our transition policies are, the more people, right, the quicker our energy transition can happen. So a more inclusive, more just policy expands political coalitions and builds power to overcome fossil fuel opposition. And here I think this is a lesson that the climate movement is maybe still learning, that people are largely motivated by what we call bread and butter issues, right? So if you can't pay your mortgage, you may be concerned about climate change, but what really is motivating you is economic security, right? These things have largely been seen as separate from climate policy, But my point is that they are essential climate issues, right? Economic security is a climate issue. And so if we have climate policies that actually address the potential for economic security and create a more just transition plan, right, that then both builds a larger, broader coalition, which builds the power that we need to overcome fossil fuel opposition and really meets people at what their needs are at, right? If you start talking about gigatons of carbon emissions that have to be reduced, very few people are going to be like out in the streets, like, totally, I'm with you, right? Even degrees Celsius, right? We live in America, nobody really knows what that means. But if you talk to people and understanding about how, right, but things like asthma from fossil fuel extraction and use, people understand that, right? The fact that you can't use large swaths of land in this country because they've been poisoned by fossil fuel extraction, fossil fuel activities, that is something that people understand. So I think sometimes this gets misconstrued as dumbing things down, but it's not actually that, right? It's like, how can we be effective in understanding what people's concerns are, and then understanding why those concerns are climate considerations. And finally, we need more just societies. I think that for every new minted billionaire is such a moral failing. And the point is that inequality and climate change are not separate issues, right? The forces that have led to this extreme wealth inequality are the same forces that caused the climate crisis. They are not separate issues, right? So inequality and the climate crisis are fundamentally intertwined, and we need more just societies. So then I think it raises this question of what do we mean by just, right? And I think if you were to ask everybody in this room, we'd all have a different definition of what just is. So who decides and defines, right? Is it workers? Is it communities? Is it what scale are we looking at? Are we thinking about just on a local scale? Is it regional? Is it global? Decision makers, who really decides and defines who is just? I don't have answers to these questions, by the way. They're just questions that I think we need to raise. What is a time frame? And I think this is really important because, again, when people have a good idea and it gets implemented, but it isn't then seen through, right? Is that really just? So if you have a just transition plan that supports workers for 2 years when they need 10 years support, right? Is that really just? And then what do we do with competing visions, right? I think, again, we have to be honest that not everybody wants the same thing, right? So what could be just to me could be unjust to you. What does that mean? Like, how do we deal with that? Like, what are the considerations? And is it that it is unjust, or is it, just unfair? So what I think about for this is, for instance, somebody who wants to continue in the fossil fuel industry, and so taking away their livelihood, is that really without support? Of course, that is unjust. If you have a supportive transition package, is it unjust or is it unfair, right? Different. So these questions, I think, are really go to the heart of what is just transition, and is something that really motivated this research that I did with my colleague Manuel Pastor at USC and his research institute that really looked at, what do we mean by just transition? There's a lot of theory and a lot of academic work around it, but people who engage in just transition activities, how do they see just transition, right? What do they think would be a just transition? And the other thing we wanted to really think about is how can a just transition be advanced? So when we start with the idea, great, but then how does that idea become reality? So just some brief about our methodology. We did a 4-state analysis, which had 32 semi-structured interviews, which means basically we had a set of questions that we asked everybody, and then if other questions, follow-up questions came, we went in the direction that they wanted to go. And we did background economic and organizing capacity research and policy landscape. So we wanted to see kind of where each state was in terms of their economy. For instance, how many workers do they have in the fossil fuel industry? How much of their economy is made up by fossil fuels? What is their organizing capacity? What does their civil society infrastructure look like? And then what kind of policies do they have? So for our case study selection, we looked at California, Kentucky, Louisiana, and New York. And we wanted to do a comparison of extractive economies, so California, Kentucky, and Louisiana. And I think it's always important to remind people that California, even though it has this reputation as being an environmental leader, is very much an extractive state, right? And then a non-extractive state like New York. And then mix of political landscape ranging from very conservative Kentucky and Louisiana to seemingly progressive, which is California and New York. And again, I say seemingly progressive because what is on the books in these states and what is actually happening is different. And I think it's also very important to look at conservative states because that's where a lot of transition will have to happen. So we can't just assume that California and New York can lead the way. but we need to really do a 50-state organizing and transition plan. Right? And the last is a mix of climate policy ranging from ambitious, which is California and New York, and then hostile to Kentucky and Louisiana. And here I want to take a minute also, the reason why we wanted to look at Kentucky and Louisiana is because I think, again, they are really misrepresented, right? People think that these states are backwards, that the people working in these states, they're not doing anything. You hear a lot of this, like, how can this happen? But what we find is that that narrative is really false, and that there is a lot of really great work happening in these states, and that what we don't need is like, well, okay, I guess people like me talking about these states in abstract, and what we really need is like on the ground organizing and really lifting up what is happening in these states. So just a brief overview of our findings. So we did find that there is a disconnect between the literature and the lived experience. So how people write about just transition and how people who are engaging in it on the ground think about it are different. The challenges to transition are beyond policy. So it's not just that, sometimes I think people think if we have the right idea, or this idea that if only people knew, then things would start to change. But what we found actually is that there are many more challenges than just that. Power is more than a policy win, and I'll talk about this in a little bit more context. But basically, we focus a lot on, again, the right idea, and if only the right idea is in place, then that really is what we need. But there's more to power building than having a policy win. And the final point is that a social safety net helps advance an energy transition, and this is what my colleague Manuel calls the transition to justice. So again, here, this is like really understanding that social and economic policies are climate policies, and that the more just our society is, the quicker we can transition to away from fossil fuels. So the first point is that what does just transition mean? There's a disconnect between literature and lived experience. And this is a quote from an organizer in Eastern Kentucky. And they say, quote, "I could go out to the street or I could go to Walmart. I could stop 25 people. None of them would know what just transition means. You stop anybody and ask them what war on coal means, they know that. It's like, man, progressives tend to hide what they're doing and then create a language that's only for the elite. And I think that's what we've done. Everybody goes through a transition, right? You're getting a divorce, it's a transition. You lose your job, it's a transition. We know this terminology. The whole idea of a just transition, meaning fair, more equitable, thoughtful, green, none of that really resonates. And so it's basically language made up by elites for elites to keep regular people out of the debates. And I think this is really important for many reasons. So one, when you say war on coal, automatically, right, you all have an image in your head of what that's talking about. When you say just transition, to this person's point is like, well, what is the transition, right? And then we just talked about, we don't have similar definitions of just. And so I think the point here is that we cannot let language substitute for organizing, right? It's important to note here that this is not in opposition to an energy transition, right? It is opposition to the idea that someone from the outside can come in and start talking about just transition and assume that everybody is on the same page. And I think it's also, as we're talking again about like just transition being co-opted, you see these things like just transition, just and equitable transition, just, equitable, and fair. Arguably, if a transition is just, it is also equitable and fair. And so when I see things like that, I'm a little bit concerned that we're thinking about, we just need to have the right words and then people will know what we're talking about. And what this point is that it's not about having the right words, right? Terminology can never substitute for organizing. The next point is that challenges to transition are beyond policy. So again, this is from somebody from Kentucky, and they say, quote, "We have spent many years trying to figure out what are we shifting to? And I feel like now we're at this point where we kind of have it figured out, but we lack a lot of the capacity, both financially and just, people capacity to implement it in a way that I feel could be really impactful and really powerful. But I think now, our efforts really need to turn more inward and think about how do we meet people in the region where they are, and then bring them into this and bring them along with us instead of just recreating this extractive model of taking a lot for them without listening and without trying to help them do what they want to do." So I think this is really important, particularly for people who do research, and to be aware that we can also be extractive, right? So going in and, interviewing a bunch of people and not giving anything back, that is an extractive model. And, we're not going to stop the worst impacts of the climate crisis by continuing extraction in whatever form it is in. And so, what they're saying is that people know what they need, right? So again, directly impacted stakeholders know what they need to transition in a way that is just to them. What they don't need is just people coming in and telling them what to do. So to me, what this quote means is like, where are our resources going? Right? And that it's not, again, that the people on the ground are incapable, but they are under-resourced because, funders, for instance, go to big states as opposed to funding, local efforts in these areas. And I think this is also, you should be very wary when you hear people say just transition is X and they have some prescriptive idea, right? Because what this person is saying is that we have our own ideas. We know what to do, right? So listening to directly impacted stakeholders and understanding what just transition is for them is what will be a just transition. People from the outside coming in and saying from a top-down mode of what is just transition, it's not going to work, right? So when I think about this, I think, at the heart of just transition is that we need a fuel source replacement, but what do we need in addition to fuel replacement that will ensure that the transition is just? The next point is that power is more than a policy win. So this is from somebody from Louisiana, and they say, quote, "My definition of a win now is watching power be built, being able to see power built. For the first time, 100 groups plus across 5 states said, I'm going to be in charge of my own destiny. I'm going to put down what I want to see. I'm not going to wait for somebody to give it to me. We're going to declare what we want, and we're going to do it together. And that is power building. We're building a movement. We're not building a piece of policy." So this is in response to the Gulf South vision for a Green New Deal, which brought together 100 groups across the Gulf South. And it was the first time that there was a vision across those 5 states. And I think this is particularly relevant for funding, right? Because policy campaigns are very easy to fund because they have defined metrics, right? Did the policy pass or did it not pass? But what you need to build to pass policy is power, right? And so power building, base building, those things are harder to quantify, but you don't get the policy win without the power building, right? So understanding that we need to start thinking about policy campaigns in a much broader scope and thinking about funding from a much broader scope. Base building, organizing, power building, nothing really changes without these elements. So how can we think about ways to fund them and get away from this idea that we need kind of metrics for success? And finally, that a social safety net helps advance an energy transition. So again, from a Kentucky advocate, quote, "Well, I tend to think first about the energy sector, but it is clearly not, we're not just thinking about the energy sector, right? And so over the last 5 years, what I have learned is that the single most important just transition policy that has actually improved the quality of life for Kentuckians has been the Affordable Care Act, without a doubt." So why does the Affordable Care Act improve people's lives? Because it decouples health insurance from your employer. So if you lose your job, you don't necessarily lose your health insurance. Obviously, it is not the health care system that we want, but it's the one that we have. But the point being, right, is that when you have a more just safety net, you can actually transition people more easily. So for instance, if we made it easier to organize workers in general, more renewable energy workers would organize, right? If we made it so that people had economic supports generally, then when they lose their jobs because we are transitioning away from fossil fuels, they're not left behind, right? So the region that people talk about most when we talk about an energy transition is the Ruhr region in Germany. And they have largely transitioned away from hard rock coal mining. And during that transition, they did lose some workers, meaning that some workers were not able to find new employment. But because they have such a strong safety net, they didn't fall into the economic despair that they would do in the States. So the more just our society is, the more we will be able to have a just transition, which means that things like the PRO Act, which will make it easier for people to organize, is a climate policy, right? Raising the minimum wage is a climate policy. Ensuring that people have health insurance, that is a climate policy, right? We need to break out of this idea that the only thing that the climate has to deal with is emissions and understand that these policies are climate policies because they will help us accelerate the energy transition. Okay, and I'm wrapping up so that we can get to Q&A. Sorry, blah, blah, blah. Okay, key takeaways. So empirical study shows that differing visions of just transition are not fatal, but coalitions must develop a shared vision. So again, not everybody has the same idea, but the point of organizing is that you come together and you have a shared vision that everybody can get behind. So we don't all have the same idea, but that doesn't mean that that is fatal, right? Organizing can then have people come together and produce a shared vision. Change requires power building and also understanding how to deploy power, and power must be shared within a coalition for success. So it's not just that we have to build power, we have to use power, right? Which means things like we don't just agree with everything that the Biden administration is doing because we want access to power. That is actually not power building or deploying power, right? Power building is when you can use your power to make people do things that they don't want to do, right? So we have to deploy power. And more broadly, we have to become much more comfortable with thinking in these terms, right? I think sometimes the climate movement has been about like, we're about the science, listen to scientists. No, listen to organizers, right? We need power and we need to build power and deploy power, and we shouldn't shy away from the fact that we need power. Cultural organizing as important as political organizing. And what I mean by this also is that understanding where people are at. But to be very clear, we cannot use this as an excuse to delay the energy transition. So what you hear a lot of now is that, no, because coal is tied to people's identity, we cannot transition away from that. No, that's not what I'm saying at all. Understanding how people relate to coal helps you become a more effective decision maker and organizer. But that does not mean we don't transition away from coal, right? So understanding cultural organizing helps us become more effective, but it cannot be used as an excuse to delay the energy transition. Wins are more than legislation. They also require power building and movement infrastructure. I think I have beaten this to death. There's no prescriptive absolute definition of just. And I think that's okay, right? So there is not really a universal definition of like just transition means this. And there shouldn't be, right? Because just transition will look different in different places. So what is a just transition in California will necessarily look different than what is a just transition in Kentucky. And I think that is okay, as long as it is directly impacted stakeholders that are the ones that are formulating these ideas of what is just. And finally, state-based efforts are essential to advancing climate justice. So I think a lot of attention, is at the federal level about, national campaigns. And my colleague Manuel always says that there's a difference between a federal campaign and a national campaign, right? So federal legislation is one, but a national campaign is actually a 50-state campaign, right? So understanding that we can have a national movement that is based in states. So in conclusion, a just energy transition will be complicated, expensive, and require political will, but inaction is not an option. So, even when I say that's expensive, I say it just because people will always ask, like, isn't this going to cost a lot of money? Yes, but what will cost more money is if we don't do anything. So it is in some ways cheaper for us to not in some ways. In every way, it is cheaper for us to have an energy transition than deal with the consequences of unabated climate change. Addressing past harms, meaningful engagement in decision-making in the present, and creating inclusive and equitable opportunities for the future will create a pathway to a just low-carbon future. So we have to have all of them, right? We have to think about and address what happened in the past. We have to ensure that we are creating equitable jobs in the present, and that we have to continue to ensure that these workers and communities are supported in the future. Just transition requires eliminating, not displacing injustice. And this goes back to, again, we need more than just a fuel source replacement. So for instance, if we have solar panels that are built in really extractive ways, that doesn't really get us a just transition, right? That's just displacing our injustice. So we actually need to eliminate injustice, not just displace it. And finally, it is important to use the energy transition to transition to a more just society. We need more than a fuel source replacement. We need a more just society overall. So thank you, everyone. There's a lot of information, I realize, but I'm really looking forward to Q&A and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much for that amazing talk. I'm sure there are tons of questions in the room. We're happy to entertain. Leia.
Thank you, Mijin. Can you talk a little bit more about what role you see for the federal government in this? Is it symbolic? Is it getting Biden to say the words just transition? I think it's really compelling, this argument that the states have a really big role to play, and I totally take the point, federal versus national, but so where is the federal government in all this?
Yeah, there's a great question. And of course, there's a role for the federal government. So for instance, the federal government can mobilize resources on a level that states never could. So that's a really good way for the federal government to support. Also coordinating across different agencies is another way that federal government can kind of streamline transition policies and ensure that, the different agencies are talking to each other. And then, if we think about something like drawdown, I think that definitely is something that has to happen at the federal level, right? So either through nationalizing the fossil fuel industry or like setting, federal targets of, 10%, 20% reduction over the years, that's obviously something that needs to happen at the federal level, because I think that also helps states that are not as politically progressive, right? So if the federal government can set a floor for how much we have to decarbonize per year, that then helps, people in those states that are not as progressive politically.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you so much. That was really a lot of information, but great. So thank you. I'm wondering, why, I mean, obviously states and 50 state model, very compelling. However, I wonder if, it might be that you need to go even smaller, to even more local levels in order to really mobilize people and to make networks, where something has happened, take activists, have them network, so that where just transition has happened or injustice, is abounding just about everywhere. But I just wonder, I mean, I get the state organization, but maybe it would be more effective at a smaller level. Just your thoughts on that. Sorry, that was very incoherent.
No, that was great. And I think you're absolutely right. I think we need all levels, right? So particularly when we're thinking about what do directly impacted stakeholders need, that's on a local level, right? And then we can think about different models. So the state is like a mini Fed in the terms of like the resources that they can mobilize is more than a local community. There's a community in Western New York that had a Tonawanda that had a plant, their power plant shut down. And something that the state did was able to give them some money so that they can have some tax income replacements. And then they could do a visioning process within the community about what do they really see like called Tonawanda tomorrow. So I think, there's lots of room at the end. So, and we need like everyone to participate. But certainly when you think about, what makes it just, it has to be very localized. Yes.
It is to meet people where they are, which really means very local concerns, like the point you made.
Yeah, 100%. Like I'm only going to convince maybe the people in this room. But if I go to, Eastern Kentucky, nobody wants to hear what I have to say, understandably and rightfully so. So 100% I agree.
Hi, thank you. I joined really late. I couldn't find this building. So my name is Gio Kang. I work at HSBC, and I'm actually in charge of the approach to the just transition within the U.S., particularly partly on the philanthropic side, but within HSBC operations and with its clients. So HSBC is committed to be net zero in our operations by 2030 and net zero with all our financed emissions by 2050. This means that if our clients aren't net zero by 2050, we're not working with them. But when it comes to just transition, everything that we have right now, all our socially linked, sustainability linked finance, all our green bonds, they're all linked to really like the climate and the carbon emissions KPIs. But we need to figure out what kind of KPIs make sense on the social side so that we're doing this equitably, we're doing this inclusively. So with that kind of in mind, what are certain ways corporates, and if corporates are too broad, banks, financiers or other financial institutions, what are some like best practices or KPIs we should look forward to for the just transition? Thank you.
That's a good question, and maybe not exactly in my expertise, but one, making sure you don't fund any fossil fuel extraction or use, right? That is huge. I mean, I don't know if this is what private sector people do, but you could put a lot of conditions on their money, right? So companies that don't pay their workers well or don't let their workers unionize, you could not finance. We think about just transition from a finance perspective. You could also fund just transition efforts. It requires quite a lot of money. But I think, really thinking about where the money goes and who it's going towards is a really, I think KPI, is that key performance indicator? I have no idea what that means, sorry. Yeah. Okay, yeah, key performance indicator. Okay, yeah. So I think also maybe really thinking about what does net zero mean, right? So if you're funding somebody like Shell, who says that they are net zero, but yet their operating budget has no change in any kind of outlook, is a net zero coming because they're buying a bunch of trees, and we know that carbon offsets are largely a scam project. So I think that, financial sector, you could do some due diligence about what do you really mean by net zero, and are they actually decarbonizing?
Yeah. Well, that's loud. Yeah, just to echo what Professor Cha was saying, there's a lot of things that corporations do to offload things onto contractors. And so paying attention to, a company might have scope 3 net zero emissions, but they can do that just by contracting out the dirty stuff. Yeah, I was kind of curious when thinking about power, and organizing who's doing the power, like organizing and who's generating power, particularly the, not tensions between, but the distinctions between more formal unions and EJ movements. And, I'm thinking a lot about Matt Huber's argument, which I have some problems with, but just, there are differences between those modes, and, there's different kinds of historical structures that have been made to repress and to mute and co-opt those different kinds of movements. And so how do you think about bringing them together, not just in the abstract, but just as they have inherently sort of different, I guess enemies is a word, or the different obstacles. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think, one example of the tension between EJ and unions is that, unions really like utility scale solar because it's a much bigger project, so more likely to be union. And environmental justice communities are kind of concerned about whether, households have access to renewable energy. And I actually think this tension arises because we are so narrow in our thinking, right? And it's not either or, we need both. And I think the way to resolve that tension is that we need ambitious climate policy, which includes both utility scale and residential distributed solar. I think that, it's important also to remember that unions are not a monolith. So there's a lot of unions that do really great work and with environmental justice movements, but also, union members live in environmental justice communities. So we have kind of forced them into this, forced them to choose, right? Are you a labor union, are you a union person, or are you an EJ person? And the answer is both. And so I think, if we zoom out a little bit, we all have the same enemy, which is the fossil fuel corporations, right? And again, as I mentioned earlier, they're not a benevolent employer. The reason why they pay more is because of class struggle, oftentimes very violent, right? So understanding that we have the same common enemy that is creating these conditions that have kind of left people fighting for the crumbs, I think it's helpful to understand that, the enemy is not your neighbor, right? The enemy is the fossil fuel industry that is creating this problem. And so I don't think that it's an easy solution. And of course, unions have also had this history of racist and discriminatory practices, but that doesn't mean that we can't have a different path forward.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I really liked what you had to say about how a lot of climate movements listen to science first and really prioritize that. And I think the Academy definitely points people in that direction. What would you say then is the role of scientists in getting people to listen to organizers? Is there a more specific call to action? I'm interested in other people's thoughts in the room too. It doesn't just have to come from you. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, Leah and I were talking about how I really hate when people say listen to the science. I just don't know what that means. And I think it's actually really elitist and paternalistic, because scientists are, are you here motivated by emissions? What does that even mean, right? So the things that I think, so of course there's a role for climate science. I'm sorry, I didn't mean it that way. But yeah, climate science is great, but all of us have to be engaged. You're not going to overcome the power of the fossil fuel industry through white papers and having the right answer, right? We need power. So the scientists for instance, that were training themselves to chase Manhattan, I thought that was great. And maybe if science, because what it shows is that scientists are seeing themselves as part of a movement and not as kind of outside of it, right? So that was a political act. And, as the IPCC report says, climate change is a political problem. So we all need to be political actors, regardless of what our field is. And I think that often gets distorted as activism, right? Or that means that you have some kind of bias. And I think that is inherent in the bias of the Academy, right? That because I study climate policy because I want to stop the impacts of the climate crisis, that doesn't mean my work is any less rigorous. And I think we have to kind of understand these biases and overcome them, that climate scientists, I'm assuming, also study the climate because they want it not to overheat. And so I think I feel really bad now because I think climate scientists are really important, but I don't mean it that way. I just mean that, we have I think for too long had this elite discourse where if people just had the right answer, that would change things. And in fact, we know now that we need to build power. I always say things that I'm like, oh, I'm going to get in trouble for this. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
I also want to underline one other vector for potentiality. Right now, in the academic sector, for example, we see a lot of unionization, and because of how the labor movement is structured in this country, you get to, as an academic, as a scientist, you can be part of a labor council. And if you start doing work in your union, and if you have a caucus that is EJ focused, you can partake in the labor council's activities, or you can, join a caucus of your union that actually intersects with some of these sectors, like here on this campus, United Auto Workers has an EV project. They have an worker-led EV policy initiative, and anybody who's a UAW member here, which some of you might be, can become a part of that.
Another thing to think about is all science is political in many ways, but it's political in part because all science is funded. And so I go to a lot of conferences where geologists use the phrase "listen to the science," but what they mean is "listen to oil science," which is a fun little twist. But yeah, so a lot of physical scientists are getting funded. The Jackson School at UT Austin are getting funded by these oil and gas companies. And so senior scientists, for example, who sit on NSF committees, can pay attention to. The NSF is famous for saying this is too political; it's not science. Right, so scientists who are in these senior roles have a huge role of changing their gatekeeping, and less senior scientists have you can make choices to not apply for certain kinds of funding. You can make choices of who you bring to your conference. That's a very direct line to who's controlling what kind of research is happening, even if they have more power over it than we do.
I don't have a question that you can answer. I don't think. It's more just something I've been thinking about, which is like, I worry that just transition, environmental justice will become the new sustainable development. And I'm also wondering, like, why do we expect bankers to understand what a just transition is? Like, and I mean that in the most generous sense, like, you're not trained in this world, and so how do you know what to look for, even with all the good intentions that you come to that with? So I'm wondering, sort of like, it's almost like a question of, it goes back to it's not co-optation, but it's how to steer. I don't know, it's almost like a question about like the theory of political change in a way. Like, yeah, these are all just sort of swirling thoughts. So it's truly not a question.
No, I think that is really interesting and really important. And I totally agree, right? Not everybody needs to work in just transition. And to your point, I think maybe a parallel will be that there is more increased interest in climate change. So there are more courses that are being offered for climate justice and climate change, which is great. There's more student interest. But these are fields of discipline, right? So just because you are interested in climate change doesn't necessarily mean that you have the tools or the background or the skills training to actually teach climate change or climate justice. And so I think, this is like somewhat similar, like people want to glom onto the hot topic, but just transition in of itself is actually quite a radical idea, right? It's not just generating renewable energy is not just transition, right? It's important for sure, but just transition is really disrupting existing systems. So part of the reason why I had difficulty answering your question about what HSBC could do is that I don't know, because what they seem to be doing now is funding the climate crisis. So I guess maybe what they could do is change their model and like not be a bank. I don't know, but that's not possible either, right? So I think that maybe what we could do is not co-opt that language. And what sounds like you're interested in is decarbonizing your portfolio, which I think is great. that's not just transition, and maybe it doesn't have to be.
Thank you. So HSBC, I joined 2 months ago, right? I was at SEPA before, and HSBC is not funding any new oil or coal, any kind of fossil fuels since as of last fall. It's pretty new. But what we mean by the just transition, we're saying that in our pursuit for the outcome of a like a net zero world, we want to make sure that we're doing it where the communities are part of that. And HSBC previously, like years ago, I mean, we're a global bank, right? Like within the U.S., we got rid of all our retail banks. We're a global bank where most of our business is on cross-border transactions. That means we're working with large conglomerates. We're working with small medium enterprises. We're working the full spectrum that crosses different supply chains. So when we're talking about the just transition, this is very like new to us as well. But we're trying to be conscious to make sure that whatever decisions that are being made in boardrooms, whether it's M&A, whether it's starting like a new, let's say like a apparel, like garment factory, we want to make sure that that money is being spent with the right type of impact where they aren't, I mean, it's at one part, it's a risk avoidance measure for us. We're all about risk as a bank. But on the other part is when we're funding a new economy, we want to do it with the right lens and an inclusive lens.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if I'm allowed to ask a question as a climate scientist. This kind of, I feel incredibly brave right now. And then my first question, it's probably a double question. The first question, it has even a kind of a scientific link. So just looking around here at Columbia, the best funded centers at the climate school here are at least strongly considering the idea that the only way to get out of climate crisis is to work with fossil fuel companies because they only have the engineering, blah, blah, blah. So I don't believe that a millisecond, but it's still the reality that they are super well funded. So anyway, I think I really like your point, but it's way from trivial to start with the enemy is the fossil fuel companies, because with many, and that's probably a science problem, many in our community are not there at all. And I'm afraid that the power drifts actually, if anything, in the other direction. But anyway, that's an excellent starting point, I think, because that's just what it is. But we are kind of, again, just we are fighting that on a daily basis internally to kind of try to find our way forward. But I didn't quite catch. I mean, you mentioned several times. Obviously, we need a lot of power to fight fossil fuel companies. I'm not really sure I understood how, besides organization from the grassroots up, you want to realistically, or do you see in your most optimistic path thinking forward how this power switch can really occur? So maybe you can give me a few lines of hope here that seem realistic, because honestly, it really, every day it looks like the power is moving a lot, but in the wrong direction. So, and I think that's really important also to recruit students and any kind of young people to motivate them and to fight against that climate anxiety problem, which is actually huge in the junior and teenage generation in the moment, for example.
Yeah, those are really great questions. And I would again like to apologize to all the climate scientists who I think are wonderful people. And thank you so much for everything you do. I think that, I think it's okay that scientists maybe don't see the fossil fuel industry as enemies. And it's kind of building off of what Leo was saying, is we don't all have to say the same thing and think the same thing. We don't, right? So, I would say that it's helpful to have kind of different visions and different ideas. So this is the work, that I see as like the target. We don't all have to think the same way, but we all, as long as we all agree we need to decarbonize and how, and along those ways. So, in terms of hope, hope is not my renewable energy, but I understand that it's helpful. Rage is really what motivates me. But I think that power comes either through money or through people. So we're never going to have enough money as a fossil fuel industry. We just won't. But so we have to have people. And I think that that's really hopeful and wonderful, because that is something that we can do. We can organize people. And if we think about, I think especially young folks, what I think is really wonderful is like this embrace of nonviolent direct action, because, for so long, advocacy has been about being palatable, right? Like we don't want to cause too much disruption. And what I think is really wonderful for like the scientists that are chaining themselves to banks is that we don't care anymore about being acceptable. We want things to change. And I think that is so inspiring. I think that, the fact that young folks are voting, and like those things, I don't think the answer ever is just to vote. I think that's really paternalistic and a terrible thing to say to people when they're facing some real severe consequences. But the other thing that I would say is that, the future is not written. And it's never too late to change what we're doing. And every degree of warming that we present will save us, right? Every emissions that we don't emit will save us. And so, I think that the new form of climate denialism is that it's too far, it's too hard. Well, everything is hard. Right? I mean, nothing is easy. And that shouldn't dissuade us. And I think that we are the ones that get to write the future. And so to me, the fact that you can build power through people is really great. That means we can do it, right? We just need people. And things can change. Things always change. And we are too often stuck in like, it's unrealistic, and we only think that things that make humanity better are unrealistic. When it comes to ruining things, like apparently every billionaire can go to Earth, can go to space, that's fine. But we can't decarbonize our electricity sector with technology that we know already exists. I just think that, the future is not written, and we get to choose.
Any last questions? Great, thank you for an amazing Q&A. Let's thank our speaker once more.